And we will come back to the timeline, but we have a whole slate of guests coming into the studio, and our first one is here now. So welcome to the show. Morgan, how you doing?
Nice to see you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining.
What's going on? Are you the calmest man in America? I feel like you're just built for weeks like this.
I actually have a picture from March of 2020 during the COVID meltdown
Oh yeah.
where I was sitting. I took a picture of it. I'm watching Twitter and I have a blood pressure cuff on, monitoring my blood pressure at the time. So sometimes I have a veneer of calmness, but like here's the disconnect. I think it's important. I watch markets every day. I have for 20 years. I think they're fascinating. I watch the ups, I watch the downs. I've been glued to Twitter for the last 72 hours, but it never impacts how I invest. I think that's what's important. So
Yeah.
I worry about the economy. I watch what's going on in the last 2 days with a sense of shock and dread, but it's not. But I'm not. But it's not going to change how I invest. And I think it's only dangerous if you are glued to markets and you're like frantically buying and selling at the same time.
Yep.
Do you think that there's any, like, I feel like there's kind of a barbell strategy where you can either, not let the whims of the market day to day swing you, and you can take a much longer view, or you can actually be that trader and know that, yeah, you are going to be the one trading day to day. And maybe you go all the way into like the high frequency world. Is there just like a messy middle, or is it just like an individual asset manager just needs to find like where are they best aligned, and what kind of lifestyle do they want, I guess?
I think it's probably true that a lot of people have a gambling itch, like
Sure.
this gambling bug that has to be itched.
Yeah.
And for those people, if you tell them, hey, dollar cost average into index funds and leave it alone, they're not going to. They're just
Yeah.
like, even if that's good advice, they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
And for that person, if you can convince them to say, hey, can we put 80% of your money in index funds, and then this 20% you can go nuts with. You can trade shit coins, you can go crazy, you can do anything you want with it. That is, it seems like bad advice, but it's probably the right advice for that person. So I've always been a fan of like, you have to pick an investing strategy that works around your unique personality. And a lot of people, like everybody, me, you, everybody has personality quirks that are not perfectly rational, but we have to just accept them as part of who we are. So I'm not one to judge people who are trading and going nuts and having fun in markets, as long as it's within reason and it's just like a small portion of their net worth. Like don't do that with your kids' college money.
Yeah. Have you thought about, one of the benefits I've felt in my career of having consistently having, the majority of my quote unquote net worth spread across, maybe like 10 or so private companies, the benefit is like I just don't think about a lot of them that much, right? It's just like I'm not worried if it goes up or down. Sometimes you get an up round and you're like, cool, it doesn't really change my life in the moment. And then if the market's crashing, you're not getting daily marks, right? So you're not thinking about it. In my view, like every asset that you have that's being marked, constantly is a potential source of distraction. Do you worry about, every new generation coming online, becoming an adult at a time when they might have a meme coin, an NFT, Nvidia calls, and then they're sports betting at the same time? And it's like, how do you actually like create value in the world and like focus on the right things? I'm sure when you were 22, I'm sure you had a brokerage account, or I'm curious like even how you were investing at that time, but you certainly wasn't that like you're seeing every mark constantly. And I personally worry about what that does to people's sort of attention and long-term thinking.
I think it's easy to look at today's markets and say it's just a casino. Everyone is betting on this, and the 0-day options and day trading. Vanguard brings in more money every month than Robinhood has in total. And so like the idea that like, oh, it's all a big casino, like no, the huge vast majority of money is invested from people in their 401ks. It's taken out every other Friday and every paycheck. They're going to leave it. They forgot their password. It's going to sit in there for the next 40 years, which is like a great way to invest. So what we
Yeah.
see on the surface is always the craziness, but actually beneath it is literally hundreds of trillions of dollars just invested, diversified for the long term. That's the vast majority of it. And so I think that's the case. It's definitely gotten easier to be crazy in markets than it was. You mentioned like when I was younger, there was E-Trade and Charles Schwab, and like people could go in, but you even had trading fees. Like to place a trade costs
Yeah.
15 or 20 bucks. And when you're 19, that's enough to slow you down. And so when I started investing, yeah, I started out day trading. But it was totally like, hey, it's going to be 20 bucks in and 20 bucks out. If I'm placing $100 trade, like that's a lot of it to just
Yeah.
getting sucked up by trading fees. So it was like a very effective speed bump.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. And I think it's hard to push back against free trading, like lower costs. That's great.
Yeah.
But it removed a speed bump that incentivizes a lot of really bad behavior.
We've been hearing about this idea that like maybe we're moving into like a kangaroo market, or I mean, the story that I tell of like the last 20 years is like dot-com bubble, big crash, slow build up, housing bubble, big crash, slow build up, tech boom. Then we get COVID, we get SVB, and we're up and down and up and down. Now we're having tariffs and Trump pump and Trump dump. Does it feel like we're moving into a permanently new regime of higher volatility because of some of the factors that you mentioned, or is this temporary and maybe it's smooth sailing in the future?
Well, I think what you mentioned there that's interesting is you feel like it's been like that for the last 20 years. I would say it's been like that for the last 200 years. Whenever we have market data, it's always been like that. So yes, what you just described for the last 20 years is accurate. Before that, there was the S&L crisis in the 1980s, the inflation in the 1970s. There was a boom. Like the 60s were a wild boom period. World War II, the Great Depression. Like it's always been nuts. There's never been a period of smooth sailing. And the periods that we associate with smooth sailing, like the 60s and the 90s, we know in hindsight, we're just the precursors to a giant bust that happened. So every time in hindsight that we're like, man, why couldn't it have been like that? Like actually that time was a terrible time. In hindsight, that was what you wanted to avoid. And so it's never going to be a case that it's more that it's smooth sailing. Like it's an inherent feature of capitalism that you have volatility and booms and busts. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable, but the absence of that is even worse. I wrote about this in my first book. There's a great economist, guy named Hyman Minsky, who I'll say it very quickly, came up with this idea called the financial instability hypothesis, which was the more stable the economy is, the more destabilization it's going to cause. Because when the economy is stable, people get optimistic. And when they get optimistic, they go into debt. And when they go into debt, you're going to have a crisis eventually. So it's like the fewer recessions that you have, the bigger the next recession is going to be.
Is it possible, though, going back to John's original question, that if markets are trading in part due to sentiment, how people feel about the economy, and the internet accelerates sentiment, because if I feel some way, I can go post about it on X, or I can send something to my group chat, or I can log on to Twitter, and like that sort of acceleration of basically like sentiment just moving around the world constantly. Can that cause the sort of like the phrase, we've said it on the show a bunch in a joking way, but like the bear market or bull market or the kangaroo market, where things are just like, the line over time, was like slower, right, of these cycles. And then the internet comes along and gets, basically like full adoption. And then you just have this sort of, this type of, I'm not showing it on the camera properly, but this sort of like massive up and down. And that's like the new normal.
I think it makes sense to assume that because the information age is what it is, that these things happen much faster. Because as recently as the 1990s, everybody's access to financial data was Louis Rukeyser's Wall Street and the Wall Street Journal and CNBC, like in its very early days. And that was it. So everybody more or less had the same sources of information. We were all listening to the same thing. Just like back in the 60s, everyone's source of news was Walter Cronkite. And today, obviously could not be more opposite than that. So when a news comes, it's just going to happen much, much faster. One example of this is during COVID, which, maybe prior to this week was the biggest economic shock of our lives. The market bottomed 2 or 3 weeks after the first bad news hit, like very, very quickly.
So
whereas if you look at the the economic crises of the 70s and the 80s, some of them played out over a decade. Yeah. And so I think you can make the argument that it's not that we have more bad news or even more volatility. It just happens like we process the information so much faster. That's a great thing. I would rather rip the Band-Aid off and get these things over with in 3 weeks than live through a decade of stagnation. So maybe that's the upside of it.
Yeah, it does feel like everything's kind of accelerating. Even just the last 8 years and going into 12 years, like we've been in one term president. And so there's been more oscillations there versus a 2-term president gives you 8 years of more stability. It's just interesting.
What immediately comes to mind when somebody says 5 simple words: short-term pain, 6, short-term pain, long-term gain. How does that make you feel?
Nothing's good is going to come from that. Wasn't it Xi Jinping just like a couple of months ago with all the youth unemployment? I think the phrase he used was "eat bitterness." That's what the youth should do. Is like you should just eat the bitterness that you have and enjoy it. Nothing good is going to come from that. Of course, there is logic to the idea of like invest in the short term, sacrifice in the short term for long term gain. Yeah. I'm not sure that's what's going on today with what's happening today. I don't think this is 7-dimensional chess trying to get some sort of long-term plan. I think that's a different topic. And I think there's a difference between, investing for the long run and like foregoing consumption so that you can grow your money and like, hitting your kids with a belt to instill grit in them. That's not short-term pain for long-term gain. So there's a balance that needs to be struck here.
Yeah.
What do you think? I posted an image earlier that I saw you like. Hopefully you recalled it, and it was Trump and Xi picking up pennies in front of a steamroller that was being driven by Sam Altman. And the joke was basically like, we spend a lot of time talking about AI. We obviously follow. We try not to talk about politics on the show, but we talk about policy and we've covered the trade war quite a bit. And especially today in the context, I don't know if you saw AI 2027, that sort of interactive, website and forecast. But it feels like the sort of our sentiment generally is that we're arguing over these sort of political issues, tariffs, trade wars, and you just have like AI looming in the background, like potentially going to make none of this matter at all, because if bad tariff policy can hurt the market by, or hurt the economy by 15%, but AI accelerates everything at sort of this like inconceivable rate, then it will just be like, picking up pennies in front of a steamroller. But I'm curious how you think, given that, you love the public markets, but then you're also a private markets investor. And I'm just curious how you think about investing, with this big unknown on the horizon.
Mm-hmm. I think it's not uncommon historically where an economic crisis and unbelievable world-changing innovation is happening at the same time. So the 1930s and 40s, it was Great Depression, World War II, and by the way, airplanes, nuclear energy, penicillin, all of this like world-changing. But a lot of that was drowned out by the obvious economic and war calamities that were happening. In the early 2000s, it was dot-com bust, September 11th. And by the way, this internet thing truly is changing the world every single day beneath our feet. And so it's easy to ignore that technological change because it's drowned out by the rest of the news, but it's not uncommon for it to happen at the same time. And a lot of times that new technology and the economic malaise, collapse, recession, whatever you call it, is related to each other. And so I think that probably adds to a sense of uncertainty right now, that not only were we going through the tariffs in the last 3 days, but a lot of people very rightly have woken up in just the last couple of months to what AI might do to their jobs. And a lot of these people are people for whom 18 months ago truly considered their jobs and their careers bulletproof. Mm-hmm. Coders, tech workers who, are making $500,000 at Meta, and they're coding, and they could not fathom a world in which they could be deemed somewhat irrelevant. And I think that's not uncommon during these periods as well. Like there's very rarely positive upheaval that doesn't come along with a lot of negative upheaval at the same time.
Can you talk just a little bit about how you're personally using AI? What tools and models are working their way into your daily stack, if anything?
Mostly it's just kind of fun and amusement. And in terms of work, I've tried to do a few things. I've uploaded book chapters or articles into ChatGPT and several other models and just said, hey, give me some feedback on this. And I found that it's pretty good for what I would call micro feedback of just like, hey, you probably need a comma here. It's not that good for macro feedback of like, hey, was this chapter good? Like, did it make any sense to you? It's like, so far, it's not that great for that. I'm sure that'll change. And there's probably other models that are better at that. And so it's pretty good. For writing for my profession. It's going to differ for everybody. I use it quite a bit as like a thesaurus of like I'll have writer's block on a sentence, and I'll put in my partial sentence and say finish this for me, and it's actually pretty good at that. So it's good at all these like little things for writing. It's obviously going to be, this is such a dumb take, like an obvious take, that the people who are going to do the best are the ones who use their personal skill and then use AI as a tool to leverage it, rather than the ones who are using it to replace it. So like, if you're writing and you're writing your own sentences, you're doing it yourself, and you're using AI to enhance it, that's a huge boost.
Yeah. Yeah. The book feedback thing is so interesting, because I feel like whenever you produce any content, you send it to your friends, it's always hard to get authentic feedback, and you almost need to like let it simmer and then see if they come back to you unprompted and text you, hey, I just actually read the book all the way through and I love this part. And you know that you didn't prompt them to, hey, you got to do this as homework and you're doing it as a favor.
I could not agree with you more.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. It's tough. It's tough. Somewhat related. I mean, you've done a lot of thinking and work. Recently, Jordy and I have kind of come to this kind of obvious conclusion that like there are increasing returns to scale for picking something and just making it your life's work. And instead of thinking in some short term, think long term. And this seems like kind of obvious, but it's something that I think we both wish we knew earlier. Is there an interesting like axiom or mental model or framework that you wish you had discovered earlier in your career or life?
I don't know if I wish I had discovered it. Maybe this is a very boring example, but
Please.
I like to learn with my eyes. I read. I'm not that much of a podcast guy, and I'm definitely not an audiobook guy.
Sure.
What struck me about 2 years ago is I realized the audiobook version of The Psychology of Money was selling twice as many copies as the physical paper version.
Wow.
And that blew my mind, because never in a million years have I even thought about listening to an audiobook, but a lot of people do. And that also opened up my eyes to podcasts. As you guys have figured out, I'm not much of a podcast guy. A little bit on planes, but not regularly, because I like to read. But I'm unique. I'm rare in that. Most people are like, oh, forget about reading a blog. Like, I am podcasts all day long. Yeah. And so I was a little bit late to that game, just because it's not what I do personally. But it's so clear that books, blogs, all of that, et cetera, is being overtaken by people learning with their ears in podcasts and videos. That's been like a change in my thinking. Yeah. And the people who did figure that out early on and started podcasts 10 years ago, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, those kind of people are crushing it now.
Yeah. Do you think that in the future there will be just more consumer choice in like the actual instantiation of ideas and context? Like, it'd be fairly trivial with AI tools today to, if I wanted to instead experience Invest Like the Best as a book, I could probably wire up, a Whisper API to transcribe every episode. I think Patrick already puts out transcripts, but I could transcribe it, send it off to the printer, get it mailed to me, and I could very easily read that. And and vice versa too. Even if an audiobook doesn't exist, you can have an AI read it to you. Do you think that choice will live on the consumer side? Because right now it's living on the creator side, and you have to decide, I want to do an audiobook and I have to, because I'm going to sell twice as many. But in the future, I could imagine that you have the choice to read anything, no matter what the original author intended, and is something sacrificed by this isn't as the artist intended.
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is Google's Notebook LM, lets you do that. You can upload a PDF and say, make a podcast out of this. And it's very, very good. Yeah. It's amazing. It's such a cool tool. The other example is my friend, I think he was on your show recently, David Senra. Yeah. I first came across David Senra when I read a transcript of a podcast that he did, because I'm not that much of a podcast guy. And reading the transcript, I was like, this guy's absolutely genius. This guy's brilliant. I have to go start listening to his podcast. That's one of the few podcasts that I always listen to on planes. Yeah. And so I think that still does exist. Most of the big podcasts out there have transcripts that they publish. Yeah. And if you're like me and you do an old school and you want to read, that's most of what I do out there.
Are you Kindle, iPad, printed it out? What's your playbook for reading?
I've gone back and forth over the years. I always toggle back and forth. Like I always prefer a physical book. I like the smell. I like the feel. Like
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot of evidence that most people learn better. They remember better if it's a physical book.
Sure.
But I love the ability to highlight and search in Kindle. That is so
It
effective
is
and important to me.
game changer.
And there are some apps like Readwise that let you highlight in a physical book, but it's so much easier in Kindle to have
Yeah.
just highlight a line and then you can come back to it later. Particularly for me as a writer, I want to highlight passages that I can use as prompts for my writing in the future. So to have it all right there is so great. I also love the fact that when I travel, I have 400 books on my Kindle to pick from on the plane versus taking one or two and hoping that I like them. And so it's always hard for me because I
Yeah.
absolutely prefer physical, but I always drift towards Kindle.
Yeah.
Have you been tempted going back to writing and have you been tempted to write a book to help people understand how AI will be adopted, broadly in our world and how it will sort of transform things? I'm assuming there's like a bunch of lessons from Same as Ever that we can sort of apply to understanding this technological trend. But when I think about the best content that's available on artificial intelligence today, it's not the kind of thing that, somebody in the airport is going to be walking and sort of like, they're not going to pull a great blog post out of the air, and read it on the plane, right? So it's like, how do you get people to sort of like understand the change that's happening now and the coming change, and does like kind of helping people understand that excite you, or do you not feel like you even have the clarity yourself?
I definitely feel like I do not have the clarity myself. And my take on this too is I'm not sure anybody does. Because the history of every big innovation is, looking back in hindsight, virtually nobody got it right. And even the most diehard optimists underappreciated how much change it was going to bring. My favorite example of this is when the Wright brothers created their plane, they only marketed it to the US Army because they themselves, the Wright brothers, did not see much commercial use for the airplane. They knew you could strap a machine gun on it and drop bombs out of it, and then the Army would like it for that. But the idea that the Wright brothers themselves foresaw Delta Airlines like traveling, like absolutely not in the slightest. That was true for cars. That was true for computers. It was true for the early internet. That even the pioneers, who were the crazy wild maniacs, underappreciated how much change it was going to bring. Because every new invention, it's not what you create, it's what other people like manipulate, like what you do. I remember one example, it was for Photoshop. A lot of the engineers at Adobe, when they make new tools for Photoshop, they have no clue what artists are going to do with those tools. But they're like, let's just find every way to manipulate an image and someone else will figure out what to do with this. Because you can't foresee what other creative people are going to do with your invention. And that's why even Sam Altman has no idea what AI is going to be in 20 years. That's not a put down. That's always true for all new technology.
Can you talk a little bit about entrepreneurial storytelling? It seems like it's an incredibly valuable skill, but then some founders get maybe lost in the sauce and wind up just focusing purely on storytelling, and then that needs to be handicapped. What advice do you have for founders when they are trying to tell kind of that definitive optimist vision of the future without seeming not credible?
I think we've actually gotten much better in the last couple of years at separating storytelling from just charlatan bullshit. Yeah. And like there was a period when we were not very good at that. Probably, late 20 teens, early 2020s, we were not very good at that. And there were a lot of people who got away with a lot of things that they should not have. But I think our threshold for BS has dropped as an industry in a very good way. And people can see through things very quickly. And so it's always going to be the case that, Steve Jobs was the best storyteller, and he was the opposite of a charlatan, the polar opposite of a charlatan. And I definitely feel like there is a world where, yes, you have to be a good storyteller, but there's a much stronger sense of put up or shut up. Like you have to show me the numbers of what you're doing. You can't just keep the story going forever. So that's a great thing.
I have this half joking riff that I call it Coogan's Law. And the idea is the value of coinages is increasing in a algorithmic feed environment, and compressing these big ideas down into pithy 2-word phrases has disproportional returns to the actual popularization of these ideas. So you think about Lulu Maservi with going direct. That encapsulates a very big idea, boils it down very well. Balaji has the network state. Andrews Norwitz has American dynamism, and just creating these like pithy phrases seems to be increasingly valuable. Do you buy my argument that there is a trend here? Has this always been the case? And what is your take on folks who not just write and produce thought leadership broadly, but also really focus on coining phrases and boiling their ideas down to their, essence?
I think it's definitely been true, but I think it's always been true. The golden ages of advertising was the 1930s and the 1960s. 1930s was kind of or 1920s was kind of the birth of advertising, and the 60s was like the post-war explosion of it. And that was like the David Ogilvy periods of just like they were better back then at creating little pithy phrases than most of us are today. Like there's more people doing it today, but some of the marketing, like the old like Mad Men style marketing from the 1960s was so ridiculously good in those magazine ads. I think if you wanted to argue that people have shorter attention spans today, so the value of a pithy phrase is more because they're not going to give you the time of day to read through 10,000 words to get to your point is important. But even in a 50,000 word book, like most people don't remember books. They remember a couple sentences from their books. So even if you're like, oh, I love that book. I read that book 10 years ago, changed my life, loved it. You probably remember like 3 or 4 sentences. And it's those turns of phrase that are memorable that you can, that stick with you. So I've always thought that's the goal for any book or like any book chapter is even if it's a 5,000 word chapter, what you want are 3 or 4 sentences from that people will remember and will stick with them, because realistically, that's the best you can do for actually like changing somebody's mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. On the other coinages, I have Coogan's Law. We've been working on Hayes's paradox, Geordie's paradox, or Geordie's law.
That's where the more funny you think something is, the less likely it will be funny sort of broadly. Right? So you post something on X and you think, oh, this is like the funniest thing.
This is my best work ever. And then it flops.
And then it completely flops.
And I wanted to know, is there an idea or maybe a chapter from your work or something you've put out that you think never found its footing, but you still, it's one of your babies?
I would have to think about that, but one that really comes to mind, somebody else tweeted this the other day, but I thought it was so perfect, and everybody knows this. The more time you spend writing a tweet, the lower the odds that it's going to end up as a banger. And the reverse is true. If you sit there and you're like, let me get creative and like wordsmith this, it's going to suck. But if you're just in the shower and you're like, all right, screw it, let me fire this off, it's going to be amazing. That's always the case. Everybody has experienced this. I think it's true for writing as well, like writing longer things, that good writing is very easy because if your idea is right, it's easy to articulate it. And if you get writer's block, the reason you have writer's block is because your idea sucks and it's wrong. And that's why you're struggling to articulate it. So I think the harder, if writing is hard for you, you should take a step back and say, my whole thesis here is probably wrong. If it was good, it would spill out of me.
Yeah. Is that true for investing too? You hear about these legendary deals. They had drinks, they did some napkin math, and it was the best investment ever. The deal that they were in the DD room for sending doc sends back and forth, like it was just a mess. Is there something more broadly applicable to this idea of like simplicity breeds genius or like, inspiration?
I think what's true, especially for very smart, educated people, is that the harder you work at something, the more opportunities you have to fool yourself. So if you're very smart and you have a 140 IQ and you went to Harvard and you work at Goldman Sachs and you spend 6 months doing due diligence on this deal, you are going to convince yourself of whatever you want to convince yourself of, because you have so much mental horsepower that you can create any model, come up with any theory that justifies what you want to see. And so it's like the harder you work, the more likely that your final result is going to be fooling yourself.
I've seen that too. A challenge as if you're a founder or an investor, you're probably pretty convincing, and you can be so convincing that it can be your Achilles heel, because you can convince otherwise smart people that doing something is good, and you deliver such a like a good sort of like a series of statements to get other people on board with that people are like, okay, like I think that's a good idea. And then in hindsight, you look at it and you're like, well, that was a terrible idea. That made
But I think what's even more true is not only do you fool other people, you fool yourself.
Yeah.
And I think it's true in investing that you need just enough IQ to where you can understand the important stuff, but not so much IQ that the simple stuff bores you. If the simple stuff bores you, you're gonna try to overcomplicate it in a way that's gonna fool yourself. And I don't have the intelligence or the IQ to blow myself up in a derivative strategy. I'm not smart enough to do that. So I just have like a very boring, basic dollar cost average into index funds because I've been blessed with a low enough intelligence that that's as far as I go. But I think that's a huge that's a big advantage. Yes, exactly.
It's great.
I was talking to this investor not too long ago, and I was like, and he's a very successful professional investor. And he asked how I invest. I'm like, I dollar cost average into Vanguard funds, and then I go to the beach with my kids, and that's it. And his response was, I'm so jealous of that because I think he was so smart and so educated and so credentialed that he cannot do that. It's impossible for him to do that, even if he wanted to.
Yeah.
Can you talk about hard work? Specifically, we were having a conversation with David Senra earlier this week, and I think he brought up the example of how Michael Ovitz at the end of his career said he could have worked like 10 or 20% less hard and had the same result. And this is something that John and I talk about a lot. We work really hard right now. We get to the office, by 6 a.m. We are working until we go to bed. We spend time with our family, but like very, very full on. And it's top of mind because we both have, young children between basically 6 months and 5, and we want to be able to spend time with them. And so I feel like it's this topic that's constantly on our minds of, wanting to live up to your potential, yet wanting to maximize, time with family in these sort of really important years.
It's tough. One thing that comes to mind here, there's always the criticism that we spend, I forget what the stat is, 30% of healthcare spending on the last month of people's lives, whatever that stat is. And whenever that comes up, you're like, yes, but you don't know when the last month of your life is going to be. Like, it would be great to stop spending money at the end, but you don't know when it's going to be. So when people talk about, oh, I could have been just as successful if I worked 20% less. Yeah, but you don't know which 20% of your work was wasted or not. It was always the case back in the day when I was writing a lot. I would write 2 or 3 blog posts per day. So let's say I was writing 600 to 1,000 blog posts per year. This is like 10 years ago. In 1 year, if I wrote 600 blog posts, I would look back and say, I'm very proud of 5 of them. 5 of them were really good. And the truth is that when I was writing them, I did not know which one of those 5 was going to be. I had no clue.
Yep.
So I feel like you had to put in a ton of work to get like some like much smaller level of success out of it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's usually the case. But to your point of like kids and balance and work and whatnot, I experienced that too. I think the way to think about it is like, this is a Daniel Kahneman quote. He's like, you need a very well calibrated sense of your future regret. What are you likely to look back at 50 years from now and regret? And a lot of people, including me and probably you guys, whatnot, might look back and say, man, I had a lot of career opportunity and I wasted it. That would be a regret. Of course, I would also regret looking back and saying, I didn't spend enough time with my kids. That sucks. There's this one point that I used in Psychology of Money where it was a study from a gerontologist. His name was Carl Pillemer. And he studied 1,000 elderly Americans. Most of them were 90 to 100 years old. And he writes in his book that of the 1,000 elderly people that he studied, not a single one of them, not one single person looked back and said, I wish I made more money. Not a single one of them. Every single one of them looked back and said, I wish I spent more time with my family. I wish I was nicer to my friends. I wish I was more helpful to my community. That was universal. And so I think a lot of that too, of people who have more life experience than you and I do. Like, they have very different goals than you and I probably did. They wish they had done things differently than you and I did. Now, one of my main life goals right now at this phase of my life is I want to take care of my family, my wife and kids. I want to work hard and provide for them financially. And so when I'm out working and maybe not spending as much time with them, I don't feel guilty because I'm like, I'm fulfilling a purpose that is very important to me.
Yeah.
But it's always a balance. I think a lot of people, their kids turn 18 and go off to college and they're like, I don't even know you. I didn't spend any time with you. And so I have no firm formula for that, but it's huge. It's important.
Yeah. It's a personal equation.
Well, thanks so much for joining. This was a fantastic
fantastic.
conversation. We could probably talk for another 4 hours if we had the time. So we'll have to have you back on soon.
I wish that you had the blood pressure monitor on all week.
It's
And
very
anytime it like ticks up or whatever.
It's very
we can say,
Gordon
Morgan,
Gekko.
get on the show. Let's talk it out.
Yeah.
You know,
in Wall Street, the first time you meet Gordon Gekko, he's the market's up and he's taking his blood pressure.
Take his blood pressure. I love it.
It's iconic.
Thanks.
It's an iconic scene. Anyway, thanks so much
Great
for stopping
hanging,
by.
Morgan.
This was fantastic. We'll
Thanks,
talk to you
guys.
soon.
Appreciate it. Bye.
talk soon.